Hello, I'm Lauren Kotkin, Director of Educational Programs at Exponent Philanthropy. I'm delighted to introduce today's session on succession planning. You'll hear from two members, Jane Leedy Justice and John Amoroso, who will share their foundation's succession stories. And then Sarah Beggs from Intentional Philanthropy will put some context around succession planning for small funders and talk about barriers and where to start. The stories will make you laugh and they'll make you think, and hopefully by the end, you'll have your first step written down on your to-do list. So without further ado, I present Jane, John, and Sarah.
Hi, I'm Jane Leedy Justice. I'm the president of the Leedy Foundation. It's a privilege and a pleasure for me to be with you today. I want to thank first Exponent Philanthropy for their tireless efforts to put on now a virtual annual conference. And hopefully we'll all be together and maybe even without masks by next year. But I appreciate all of your efforts. And I appreciate you inviting me to be a part of this particular session on succession, such an important topic for family foundations especially. My dad used to say that starting a family foundation was like catching a porcupine. First, you throw a wash tub over it, and that gives you something to sit on till you figure out what you're going to do next. Our foundation was shaped to a great extent over the last couple decades by a lot of us at Exponent Philanthropy conferences sitting on our wash tubs, wondering what in the world we ought to be doing next. Many of those people now are colleagues and many good friends. And so one of the first things that we all learned together as we were talking about it is that family foundations are the natural evolution of the larger story of that family. So in other words, you've seen one family foundation, you've seen one family foundation. There's no standard template that you can lay over the top of your foundation. I think our best learnings have come from the stories that we've heard, the best practices that we hear other foundations aspiring to. And so I think that the stories that you'll hear at this conference, even though they're on Zoom, will be some of the most important takeaways that you'll have. Let me tell you just a little bit of information about our story and our creation and our evolution. My father, Ike Leedy, when he was in his 70s, started a small business in Iowa. Within a decade or so, it became very successful. And as Dad, being from Iowa, said, suddenly he found himself with more steak than he could eat and no plan for how to share it. His accountant at the time, this was in the mid-'80s, suggested that he form a foundation, a wash tub, sort of, where he could sit, park the money, and decide what he wanted to do next with it. So in 1985, the Leedy Foundation was born. Dad started his founder intent document by saying, I have yet to meet a donor or a founder of a charitable foundation who said, when I started out, my goal was to make a lot of money so I could give it away. Shortly after Dad started the foundation, he asked my brother and me to be directors to help him with the stewardship of this extra stake he had. Within a year, we asked our spouses, and then the board was 5. At that point, Dad was pretty clear about why it was that he was asking his kids and spouses to be involved. He said, by inviting my children and their spouses to help find worthy causes for the investment of foundation funds, I also visualized it as an opportunity to draw our widespread family closer together. And the important thing in that for me was that he said, first, we understood that this money was public trust and that our first responsibility was to find the worthy causes. But our second benefit from this, secondary benefit from this, was an opportunity for our family to work more closely together. So there we were, sitting on the wash tub. Diversity, we covered all the major categories. Geography, we went from Alaska to Colorado to Iowa. Politics, religion, education, gender, including interests and passions. Fortunately, we liked and respected and enjoyed each other, but we really wondered how far up the values ladder we were going to have to go to find some commonality. After many somewhat difficult conversations, we ended up and settled on the values of family, legacy, service, stewardship, and leverage. And if you look at our mission statement, we were able to weave all those together in a statement that gave us a shared mission, even with all of our differences. On our good days, the diversity works really well, and we work well together, and it enriches and deepens our overall foundation work. There are other days when working with family is like herding cats. And then our family grew. We started with the founder, then the children, then we had kids, there were grandchildren. And when our children were probably early teenagers, Grandpa sat them down and invited them to help him with the stewardship of the foundation, which they really knew very little about at that point, but they were at least interested and intrigued to hear more. The best thing he said to them was that this was an invitation. It was not an expectation. Grandpa would still love them and give them Christmas presents, whether they decided to be a part of it or not. Now our children, to our delight, are dealing with their children and wrestling with how are they going to bring them along and help them understand about giving and the foundation. A good friend of mine was leading a session at a philanthropy conference one time, and somebody asked her, well, how do you know when to start teaching your kids about philanthropy? And my friend said, the first time you hear them say mine. Great thing to remember. It's never too early to begin teaching them. So we began to have conversations about succession probably a decade ago, maybe more than that. But it was so far away, and it was so difficult to talk to Grandpa about when he died. And so we just sort of brushed over the subject. We have made it more of a priority in the last couple decades, and two factors were really key to our beginning to become proactive. First one was our father's age, our founder's age. Dad, somewhere in his mid-90s, announced to us that he realized that he had actually outlived the opportunity to die young. That began the conversations a little bit more earnestly. We realized that Dad really was in his mid-90s. We didn't get very far on specifics at that point, but we did agree that within 6 months of a major change in board membership, whether that was Dad's death, one of us leaving, whatever, within 6 months of that, we would engage the services of a consultant to help us create a succession plan. That turned out to be a really important decision and documented in our minutes that we would fall back on later on. The second factor that contributed to it was my desire to be more focused. At that point, for 25 years, I'd been on the board, I'd done the administrative, I'd done the executive work. I was also getting more and more involved in our growing time that it was taking for a particular funding area for me. And what I wanted to do was focus my efforts on our foundation's influence, growing influence, in increasing the strategic engagement of volunteers in the social sector. That was really my passion alongside family philanthropy in general. But when I started thinking about passing the baton, I realized that there were 3 in the 3rd generation who were on our board at that time, but none were ready or willing to receive the baton. And it was going to become less about passing the baton and more about sharing the baton with Dad, with the 2nd generation, the 3rd generation, and the 4th generation who were coming along as well. So where do you start when you realize it's time to start? So what were the challenges that I was facing at that point? The first one, getting the family's attention. Even though Grandpa had admitted that he wasn't getting any younger, our family actually thought in the back of our minds that he might live forever. It was impossible for us to imagine the future without him. Second piece of that was they'd seen me involved almost forever. It was my passion. It was my calling. They figured that I would probably continue in this forever until I died in the middle of giving some speech at a family philanthropy conference. And my sister-in-law by then was managing the operations of the foundation pretty smoothly. So the third generation were able to be focused on marriages, kids, jobs, school, etc. They kind of subscribe to the adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. In this particular case, that would translate into, if they ain't dead, don't replace them. In 2015, my father died at the age of 99 and 9 months. He said he just couldn't quite make it to 100. He was still very involved right up until the end, but he wasn't involved in the running of the foundation. So things were running smoothly without him. And so the sense of urgency still wasn't very strong. That's where the value of that decision back in 2014 became so important. I was able to remind them that our agreement was that within 6 months of any major board change, we would engage an outside consultant who would help us construct a succession plan. So where do we start on that? Well, we go back to the founder intent, back to the corner of the wash tub. Dad closed his founder intent document with this: my family is my number one interest. If at some time in the future the operation and administration of the foundation should be in danger of splitting the family apart, it would be my intention that the foundation and the stewardship of its assets be given to an independent agency. We were reminded that Dad's first interest was his family, but the second interest was not the foundation. It was the stewardship of the resources within the foundation. It was not loyalty to the vehicle that we needed to be concerned about, but to the stewardship of those resources and how to best leverage our relatively small dollars to produce outsized impact. It opened the questions and the topics of perpetuity, the interest of family members, whether they wanted to be involved long-term, short-term. Some of them had a secret fear that they would have to die to get out of involvement with the foundation. We were able to actually laugh at some of those things that have been so hard to talk about to begin with. And we talked about new future funding areas that fit more with the visions and the passions of our upcoming generations rather than our first and second generations. But the greatest gift that Dad gave us was that last sentence, the gift of his confidence and his blessing. I have full confidence in my family's ability to choose wisely regarding the health of the family and the stewardship of the foundation. So where are we now? We are definitely still a work in progress. I would like to say everything is all fixed up. We are buttoned up and ready to go, prepared for any kind of situation that we would run into. We do have a succession plan in place, and we have reconvened the multi-generation committee that we had in 2014, who really looked at some options for what could we do next. They've agreed to review the succession plan that we have and see how we might go about updating it. That's really going to be an important part of our putting this back on the table for us and looking with new, fresh eyes. Our communication is stronger. We continue to revisit these difficult, awkward subjects without quite the fear and trepidation that we've had before, because we've already had introductory conversations, at least, in some of the most divisive areas that foundations and families run into. Infrastructure. We took some major steps a few years ago. We've dissolved the position of executive director, which I held, and we created the position of managing director and gave Nancy that position. I'm now the president of the foundation, and I have been since Dad's death, but we also have time limits on that, and we have a goal to shoot for. Nancy's done a great job of updating our files and our systems and our policies, and we are functioning dramatically more effectively and efficiently than we did before. And we're also pleased, most important thing, with what we're doing with the grants and the foundation investments that we're making, primarily in our two key funding areas of earth protection and environmental concerns, and also capacity building and strategic volunteer engagement. By the way, if you want to know more information or get a copy of my dad's founder intent, you can go to our website, leedyfoundation.org, and there's more information than you could possibly use in a lifetime. So we are still a small family foundation, but we have made measurable impact and had leverage in the areas where we were most concerned. Now remember that I said at the beginning that there is no standard template. So I'm going to just talk about a few suggestions that I might have for you as you move forward. First one, start the conversation. You've got to start someplace. You need to start it before you need it, hopefully. One good consultant that I talked with at one time said, you ought to talk about process and policy before there's a person involved. You can think much more clearly and much more objectively if you're not right on top of a foundation changing situation, and then you have to have these discussions started. Have patience and persistence and perseverance and grace for your family members who will continue to screw up and sometimes annoy you. But that's so important, recognizing that the conversations start years before, hopefully, you actually act on them and make the decisions that you would put in place, and always be ready to change them. If it doesn't work for you, then you've got the educated history to look back on and an opportunity to make changes in your policies and procedures. Consider outside guidance. You notice I have outside in quotes. Outside is not a dirty word, but it often ends up appearing to be a dirty word to families. Oh, they're not part of the family, they don't understand. But what outside guidance can bring is tremendous in its return on investment. A family cleans up when company comes to dinner. It just is what it is. The wisdom and the experience and the perspective that someone on the outside of the family can bring, and they can both advocate for the foundation and the health of the foundation and the work that it's doing, and also all the individuals who are part of the family and need to be heard. So many times there are some people who are heard and some people who almost never are involved in the conversations. So we found our consultants to be remarkably helpful in helping us design a good process before we had some horrible relational mess that we were going to have to clean up. Infrastructure. Focus on your infrastructure. We talked to nonprofit organizations about looking internally to make sure that they are structured in such a way that they can be resilient, they can be adaptable, especially in these days and moving forward. Have we done the same thing? Have we examined our structure? Are we ready for change? Are we really willing to be adaptable and resilient? And are we ready for it based on the structure that we have currently? And the last one is celebrate. Embrace and celebrate the evolution. Someone once said that no one likes change except a wet baby. I would go along with that. We say that we embrace it, and yet it's so difficult. And yet things are constantly, the nature of our family, the members of our family, the growth in each one of us are always changing. And I would encourage you to take from your vocabulary the sentences that start with, we've always done it that way, and we've tried that before. They will not leave you many opportunities to grow the way you want to. So now what? I would just say, get comfortable on that washcloth, on that wash tub, because you're going to be there. You're going to need to revisit it often, and sit next to different people the next time you get on the wash tub. You'll be amazed at how different their perspective may be from you when you have an opportunity to talk up close with them. Families are fluid. The structure and the relationships of your foundation should allow for that. There's always more to learn. My dad used to pronounce a benediction at the end of each one of our meetings, and he would say, well, I believe the foundation is in good hands. I can still hear him saying that after each one of our meetings now. And I hope those words will be true for you and your foundation as well. Thank you.
My name is John Amoroso, and I'm the Executive Director of the David and Laura Lovell Foundation, and I'm here to talk to you about succession planning, or in this Olympic season, passing the baton. One thing I've learned over the years working with nonprofit organizations and foundation boards is that one of the most important things you can do is to make sure that whoever takes your place is as well prepared and equally as good, if not better, than you at the job you're asking them to do. That's exactly what Laura Lovell did. Just 4 months after selling their business and starting the foundation, her husband and co-founder, David Lovell, died of cancer. She surrounded herself with family members and trusted non-family advisors and proceeded to run the foundation for the next 20 years. Along the way, she taught her daughter, Ann Lovell, a full-time CPA and mother of 6, the ropes of philanthropy. Together, they did some amazing things, like participating in the Bravewell Collaborative, a 15-year international multi-funder cross-sector effort to move the practice of integrative medicine, which is combining Western medicine with evidence-based modalities like acupuncture, biofeedback, manipulation, therapeutic yoga, from woo-woo to mainstream. And now there are over 84 academic tracks in 2/3 of our medical schools and a national board certification in integrative medicine. So not bad. And Laura sadly passed away in 2013, but Anne has kept the torch burning, in many ways surpassing her mother's energy and impact. She is the past chair of Women Moving Millions, a tireless advocate for gender parity, an investor in high-impact documentary films such as Ailey, which just came out, and still works as a CPA. But her children and other trustees' children, the proverbial 3rd generation or 4th generation, have busy lives of their own, and they're not always in the same financial position as their elders. And attending fundraising events, participating on committees, and traveling for board meetings and grantee site visits isn't always on the top of their priority list. Laura never envisioned a total professional foundation without family leadership, but she also didn't want it to be a burden on family. So her daughter Anne was left with the job of trying to weave together an effective foundation with engaged family leadership. Now, Anne knew she needed help, but she also needed to learn what kind of help she needed. So she first worked as the executive director for the foundation for over 2 years in order to figure out what the job should look like. Then she hired the first non-family executive director, but they only lasted a little while. The board regrouped, they contracted with an interim executive director and conducted an 18-month national search process. And when my wife found the announcement on the internet, we were already in the process of trying to move closer to my parents who lived just south of Tucson. So as I was interviewing, I got some advice from a mentor, the former CEO of a foundation I worked for in Oregon, who said, make sure you're a good fit with the family. But once Anne and I met and the rest of the board, it became very clear that we would get along. So I took a leap of faith and I made the move. But soon after I got started, I began to figure out how the foundation really worked. There are certain things you don't find out in an interview process. They may not be written down or people aren't willing to talk about them openly. So I had to listen and begin asking questions. At first, it was not an easy thing to do because we were just getting to know each other and emotions were still raw after Laura's death. And there were some health concerns that were difficult to discuss and I hadn't fully grasped. But I slowly began to piece together the situation. First, the foundation's policies needed updating. Next, there was a wide range of trustee engagement in the work of the foundation, everything from hardly at all to a whole lot. And finally, there were already Generation 3 family advisors on the board, some of whom were potential candidates to become trustees. Now, just in case you're thinking, my foundation doesn't need a succession plan, things will just take care of themselves. I mean, we're all related and we're always getting along at board meetings. Well, here is one fictional example of bad succession planning. For those of you who aren't Game of Thrones fans, King Joffrey is a teenage despot who ascended to the throne because of family fighting, and he tends to shoot his subjects with a crossbow just for fun. Now, most foundations won't have anything close to that happen in real life, but it's still amazing how awkward things can get when you combine family, money, and power. For instance, here is poor Mrs. Taubman, the widow of Alfred A. Taubman, one of Michigan's richest men and an earlier developer of the shopping mall, and the eventual owner of Sotheby's auction house. She's standing with her bags outside their London flat for 8 hours because soon after Alfred's death, her stepchildren had the locks changed, and they were in the process of having the art in the apartment appraised by Sotheby's in order to, wait for it, auction it off and fund the family foundation. And to my knowledge, Mrs. Taubman was not asked for her opinion on this matter. So you may be convinced that nothing like that will ever happen to you or your foundation. But I knew I still needed to take precautions in order to protect the interests of the Lowell Foundation. And the first step was figuring out what area of succession planning we needed to do. Did we need long-term or strategic planning in order to determine who can lead the organization and how to cultivate new leadership? Or was it short-term, tactical, or emergency planning for what to do if one of your leaders literally passes on? And we needed to walk the walk here because one of the major efforts of our foundation is support for end-of-life care planning and having and sharing advanced directives with your loved ones and your providers. So in order to answer those questions, I had to spend some more time digging deeper with my board in order to hear the views on preserving the founder's legacy, assess their willingness to lead, uncover unspoken family dynamics. And in those conversations, I learned about the thousands of hours of personal time, the tons of emotional energy, and even the personal money spent on the foundation. It had truly been a labor of love over the years. So it was important to take that time, ask those questions, and listen so we could figure out how to honor those commitments and also move forward with plans for smooth leadership transition when necessary. Once I sensed a willingness to start, we had some choices to make on what to tackle first, updating policies or start grooming successors. To be honest, I was more than a bit nervous about not having an emergency succession plan. And thankfully, by taking that time to listen first, I was able to develop enough trust that I could convey a sense of urgency about succession planning with the board, and they agreed to move forward. So we jumped into action. We got examples from other exponent members, and we worked with our attorney to update both our bylaws and to finalize a specific succession plan. We began to have explicit discussions about who was the most likely next trustee so that we would be ready in case something happened immediately. And we used Exponent's Next Generation Trustee Program to train 2 of the 3rd generation advisors. One of them said, "We feel a lot better after listening to some of the really bad problems from other foundations." And after just 1 year of work, the board had elected its first 3rd generation trustee, with another one trained and waiting in the wings. So even with a plan, we still learned we had some basic lessons and we had to make some adjustments. For instance, one of the trustees had absences due to ongoing health problems, and bringing on a 4th trustee made it harder to meet quorum at in-person meetings. So we began to hold virtual board meetings. This was in 2018, and we were already Zoom experts by the time COVID hit. Sadly, we did lose a trustee, Steve Lovell, but we had a plan. We followed it, and it worked out very smoothly. There were no panic phone calls, no emergency meetings. We just enacted the plan. So remember that succession planning is a marathon, not a sprint. But just like running, the more you train, the easier it gets. So just get started with some good listening, some thoughtful planning. You will end up with a good baton pass and make it to the finish line with a smile on your face. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Beggs with Intentional Philanthropy. And while I'm with Intentional Philanthropy now, I was a longtime staff member at Exponent. So it's just a delight to be with all of you, even if just virtually. So you've had a chance to hear from Jane and John, who have both wrestled with succession and are seeing the benefits of it. We're going to end this session with a little bit of data to show you what might be more typical than what you heard from Jane and John. Just to give credit where credit is due, this presentation is a synthesis of Exponent's work, as well as Jeff Glabaki with Strategy Plus Action and Nina Cohen with Glenmead. So thank you, Jeff and Nina, for all your work and wisdom that are integrated into what I'll be sharing today. What do we know about succession planning and its importance? Over the years, Exponent has surveyed its members through its foundation operations and management report. And they ask, what are the most important issues facing your foundation today? In 2016, which is the most recent time they asked that question, board or generational succession was the #1 issue. 55% of respondents selected this as one of the top concerns their organization faces. So you can see in this table how this fared compared to other contents, which you would think are really important as well, like having an impact in your grant making. It supersedes that in importance quite a bit. And ever since we started asking that question in 2006, it has topped the list, except for one time, which was 2009, right after the market crash. So in short, this topic is on a lot of people's minds, and it's just getting more and more important. So you're really not alone if you've come to this session thinking, ooh, I need to start thinking about this. So with a topic that's this important, that people acknowledge is important, a lot of foundations must have succession plans done, right? Well, that's what's kind of interesting. When we look at the stats, that is not the case. In 2015, we asked and learned that the majority of foundations do not have any succession plan written down. As you'll see, those who have a succession plan are less than a third. Only 24% have written plans for both board chairs and board members, and a smaller portion had a plan only for board members and only for board chairs at 5%. So what you see is that written plans are not at all common to foundations, and yet it is of great concern to people. So what's really important to think about is why the disconnect. And what we want to do through this session is help people move in a direction so that their concerns around succession planning can really be addressed and they can move forward in that way. So let's talk about what the goals of a succession plan would be. First off, a succession plan anticipates transitions. You know, some changes you know are coming, like board rotation. That's an easy thing to think about. Others are more unexpected, but they come up from time to time. And sometimes they are so sudden and abrupt as they actually create a sense of crisis or emergency. Your succession plan should really allow for all of these categories, both the expected and the unexpected, and may include one or more types of succession. Most of what you've kind of heard about today is sort of board succession, though John certainly was part of the executive director succession. But he spoke a little bit more about how the board transitioned. But there's ways that you should be able to address in a succession plan all these different pieces, including sort of bringing on the next generation of board members as well. The primary objective of all of this effort is twofold. First, to reduce the disruption that occurs in your foundation when leadership changes take place. And second, in the meantime, it actually gives you peace of mind. You know, there are corollaries to this too. For example, you know that you've dealt with the elephant in the room. There's a lot of anxiety that plays out if you don't do that. So it's sort of like this. Leadership succession planning is an acknowledgement of the reality that people and organizations change over time, And then it's natural and inevitable, like the seasons. You know, having a leadership succession plan is like having your winter coat stored in the attic all summer long, instead of, you know, throwing it away in the spring when you're done with it and then buying a new coat every year and having to go out and figure out what you're going to do. You actually have it there and you realize that you can take it out when it's turned cold. Or, you know, I suppose if you live in a tropical climate, it's like having a raincoat near the front door if it suddenly starts to pour. Your foundation succession plan is going to look very different from other foundations plans, just like, you know, based on your foundation's culture and its needs and who's involved in the foundation. Just as, you know, the weight of your winter coat will be different depending upon where you live. You know, it's really common, as we sort of see in the statistics, even though people are worried or concerned about succession, to not do anything about it. It's common for whole boards to want to, you know, put off the inevitable. Change and leadership transitions, they disrupt our plans. We just want to keep things going along, chugging along. And so it's really easy to avoid thinking about it and talking about it until we really have to. Especially in today's world where there's a lot of other things going on. I think it's easy to put off. But the truth is, storms happen. And having a succession plan is one of the key ways to reduce sort of the turbulence that comes with those storms. A term coined by family business consultant Ivan Landsberg is succession conspiracy. It's the situation where the status quo on a board is that board members consciously or unconsciously conspire to avoid succession planning. This is when you or the board are not even willing to look down the road at the storm that may be coming. You'd rather keep the blindfold on. So while this is really common, we want to encourage you and your board to really think differently, because it can save you a great deal of angst and challenges. So the process, you know, when you think about succession planning, can actually be empowering and positive. When the succession plan has been created, you can rest easy, knowing that you have your raincoat or your winter coat and your summer gear ready to go, right? Remember that leadership transitions can also provide for new beginnings, new energy, new thinking, new levels of engagement. So with this fresh perspective, let's move forward and talk a little bit about some of your first steps that you might consider. One of the first steps might be to actually recognize what's happening with the board emotionally so that you're better prepared going into the conversations. You know, thinking about succession, as we said, can bring up some pretty strong emotions and complex situations for you and your organizations. You know, anxiety, sadness, guilt, excitement, expectations, you know, intergenerational conflict, maybe even ambition or envy or revenge. I mean, these are all things that can come up with a family in particular, but also with independent boards. So thinking about all those feelings and complexities, you know, let's just lump them together under one term called energy, right? And let's just say that it's important to understand where the board's energy is. Is it relatively mild? Is it intense? What are the specifics behind that energy? Just as John alluded to, individual conversations are a really important piece of gaining understanding of this particular portion of the work. Understanding where each person is coming to the table as you start the work is super important. The next step, once you know where board members are emotionally, you can really begin to assess what roadblocks might apply to your foundation. So these are some of the roadblocks that you'll see. So just not knowing who to bring on to the board. There may be board members spread across the country or even across the world, which can make bringing a board together really difficult. It can be difficult, especially if you've waited a really long time to engage people, to know how to inspire them to engage. They may feel like, well, that was your thing and I've never been included in it. So, you know, I'm not interested now. But there are ways to overcome that. And there are lots of our members who have confronted those same challenges and have overcome it. I think a lot of times when people try to engage their children in particular, they're often at very busy times of their lives. So how can you engage people when there are more pressing priorities? It's common for different family members to have divergent values. And that too is something that can seem like it's just an insurmountable roadblock. But we have families that that have worked together to find values that they really do have in common. Oftentimes the superficial things of how we know people are not actually at the core of who they are. And so that's one of the things we really encourage people to look at, is finding ways to find common values. Interpersonal conflict, that certainly can play a role in foundations, and it's something to think about. There are lots of ways to work through those dynamics as well, including bringing on independent trustees who are not part of the family. Maybe the one that, you know, is why you don't have a succession plan in the first place is that people just haven't been willing to discuss the topic at all. And while that certainly is a roadblock that can be challenging, it doesn't have to remain so. So figuring out which one of these is most relevant to you is really important. So I encourage you to take time after today's session and state the reasons why these particular things are so challenging. You know, maybe figure out which one or two are the most critical or the most obvious, and then think of the reasons why they're so challenging. And then through Exponent or other peer support groups, reach out to others who are either currently wrestling with these issues or have done so in the past. You know, there's a great deal of wisdom out there that can make your process significantly easier. And then once you've done those two things, I think really taking time to dig into the excellent materials that Exponent Philanthropy has on succession. I know that there are a couple of resources that are linked to this session. Especially, I want to direct you to the Leadership Succession Tear Sheet. That's sort of a how-to and what to think about. And then the Leadership Succession Planning Guide, which is a very detailed guide of all the things you should be thinking about, whether it's a board succession or an executive director transition. It really brings a lot of the detail to mind about what you need to be thinking about. That's it for today's session. We wish you the best as you move toward creating a succession plan that works for your foundation. You know, it is worth the wrestling and the time. And if you have any thoughts or questions or reflections that come up as you start to engage in this work, feel free to email me, call me. I'm certainly happy to field any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah, John, and Jane, and thank you for joining us. Please fill out the evaluation in the window below, and we'll see you in the video after chat.